Thank you very much, Matt Litz, Smithsonian Books.
This week on History on Book TV, Indonesian Destinies. Theodore Friend documents the largest Muslim nation in the world from its 1945 independence to the present. The program runs an hour.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's so good to see you at this meeting of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. As we all know, since September 11, 2001, heightened tensions between Muslim nations and the West have resulted in dramatic changes in international relationships. The largest of these Muslim nations is Indonesia, a vast archipelago of 17,000 islands, 6,000 of them inhabited and 11,000 uninhabited, home to some 232 million people. Indonesia, since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, has become the fourth most populous country in the world. Its largely Muslim population is more than 3/4 as large as the United States. And incidentally, this country is Indonesia's largest oil customer. In the last 5 years, Indonesia has experienced uprisings, terrorist attacks, and frequent changes in leadership, but has managed to hold its first free national election in decades. Today, Indonesia faces severe economic problems, successionist movements, military actions, bureaucratic corruption, and nepotism. Our guest, Theodore Friend, whose friends call him Dory, is a teacher, historian, and novelist, and is now a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. He was president of Swarthmore College near Philadelphia and president of the Eisenhower Exchange Fellowships. Among other honors and positions, he is a member of the Board of Advisors of the U.S.-Indonesia Society. Dr. Friend's first book, Between Two Empires, The Ordeal of the Philippines, won the Bancroft Prize in American History, Foreign Policy, and Diplomacy. His current book, Indonesian Destinies, is the first full-scale history of the Indonesian nation-state from its revolution against the Dutch through last October's terrorist bombings in Bali that we all read about. Using many first-hand accounts, Dr. Friend describes the effects of the dictatorial rule of Sukarno and the economically successful but unpopular rule of Suharto, as well as Indonesia's 1999 request for a UN peacekeeping force to restore order in East Timor. In his book, he addresses the question of how Indonesia might generate leaders better than Sukarno and Suharto, and whether Indonesia will be able to invent its own style of democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to our podium the author of Indonesian Destinies, Dr. Theodore Dory Friend.
Thank you very much, Diane, and not just for a generous introduction, but for laying out a lot of the groundwork for my talking with you. That was a very nice summary of a lot of the major salients of recent history in Indonesia and the problems it faces, and I appreciate that very much. Greetings to all members of the Los Angeles World Affairs Council, and a special greeting to Selamat Datang Pak Kusumo Priyo, and may you have a very happy residence in the United States. The simplest, sharpest question I want to pose at the outset, which is, will Indonesia, after these nearly 6 years now of tremendous crises, reform or regress. But let me go back into the last 6 years a bit. In July '97, the Thai baht crashed, and a lot of other things began crashing with it. At the same time, the temperature of the currents in the Pacific began going in a crazy way, and El Nino began to hit, droughts, and with them enormous fires. The largest fires anywhere in the world in the 20th century struck Indonesia across the next several months. And if that weren't enough, there were lots of social inflammations that had been building in Indonesia under Suharto. Whatever the progress was, as Diane observed, his unpopularity was rising, and there were many social flammabilities in Indonesia. So think of it as three fires: the currency melting, the forests flaming, and the people on fire too. By May '98, all of that came to a head with the riots in Jakarta. The detail is in my book. I can't pause here on that, but it brought down a dictator who had been in power for 32 years. Only Fidel Castro had been in power longer, and Fidel is still there. But Suharto went. And since then, there have been 3 presidents. 2 have been Muslim. Abdurrahman Wahid, known as Gus Dur, followed Habibie, who was Suharto's vice president, and then by impeachment of Gus Dur, in came Megawati Sukarnoputri, the daughter of Sukarno, the very first, the revolutionary president of Indonesia. So most of its history had been a matter of Sukarno and Suharto. And now we have a lot of change. And the question is it going to be, how much of it will be continued reform, and how much of it is going to be regression back into less creative habits? I'll talk about that in terms of military culture, business culture, political culture. We may have time for a little psychological culture, which is sometimes the most basic of all. And I'll try to give a general summary, and then we'll have questions of 25 minutes or so. Is that right, Curtis? Which I really look forward to. So don't let me go on beyond my slice of time. I want everybody else in here to have at me however you wish. Military culture first. How much reform, how much regression is going on there? The good phenomena are that the Army has now been split out of the bureaucracy, where there used to be thousands of military officers placed there by Suharto, and that's good to get it out, them back into the uniforms of professional soldiers. They've also been reduced in the parliament, and by '04, the next major national election, they will be out of parliament altogether. That's a good thing, don't we, as most of us Americans think. The Army does not need a guaranteed block of the parliament, either for the sake of a good parliament or of a good army. So that's headed in the right direction. And thirdly, the Army's ties to the Suharto political party, Golkar, have been formally cut, and that's also positive. The old slogan of dual function of the Army, which meant that it was supposed to help develop the country as well as to protect it. It really meant any function, every function. That is no longer used. And so there are signs that Indonesia is catching up with the idea of a professional army, at the same time as there are signs that it is not. They still have a territorial structure, they call it, which means, as one very brave Indonesian newspaper woman commented, the military's everywhere. They're like an army of occupation, which is a pretty insulting thing to dare to say in one's own country of one's own military. The territorial structure is still there, and so are turf battles with the police. Police and military functions have been separated, which is another good thing, but then you find military and police vying for control of different businesses, including gambling houses and other activities that, in a setting as beautiful and with people as well dressed as this, I don't want to talk about. So these are not good signs. 70% of the income of the Indonesian army is off budget. Would you tolerate that? Would you allow the Pentagon to allow that to happen? I know you wouldn't. But in Indonesia, what can be done about it? I look for my new friend right in front of me here, and I beg forgiveness if I seem to overstate any of these things. But I do want to make clear that, in my view, the fact that only 30% of the Indonesian army's money can be audited is a very dangerous factor. If you can't audit them, you can't govern them. They've got an ungovernable army, which makes for a country difficult to govern. Human rights violations by the Indonesian military are in our newspapers. I don't have to describe them further here, but maybe I should quote the commander of the army directly on important matters of policy. The commander appointed by President Megawati is a man named Riamazard Riochudu. A reporter asked him in a gathering, probably no bigger than this, an apparently innocent but really penetrating question when he was appointed: what will you do with protesters? He had a 4-word answer: shoot rioters, exterminate provocateurs. He doesn't waste words. That's a very tight policy statement. So, as if that weren't quite enough, he allowed himself, somewhat later, to congratulate some army officers who were convicted of killing a separatist in Papua, the large province, the most, as you're looking at the map, the easternmost province of Indonesia. A man named Theis Eluai, who was alleged by the military to have had a heart attack after dinner with some of them. And that's why his car had plunged off the cliff. The coroner's report said that Theis Eluai's tongue protruded 2 centimeters from his mouth. I'm not a physician, but I don't believe that's the usual symptom of a heart attack. The army then changed its story, and the eventual verdict of the eventual defense plea was accidental asphyxiation. Well, and for asphyxiating somebody seeking the independence of Papua, some officers were given sentences, and To get back to General Riamazard, he said they were heroes. So he meant it when he said, exterminate provocateurs. He called men who did that to one heroes. I'm trying to give you a mixed picture of Indonesian military culture as time goes on. I'm sorry if I've dwelt a bit upon things that don't get into our newspapers but deserve to be in the consciousness of American citizens who think seriously about international affairs. What about business culture? My book talks about examples of what I came to call split-level free enterprise. I believe from introductions and short conversations that I'm in the company of a great many business people here tonight, and you'll be wondering what I mean by a term like split-level free enterprise. I've met, I believe, a lot of wholehearted entrepreneurs and free enterprise people. Here's what I mean. I would talk with leading Indonesian industrialists and financiers, and I would get a terrific impression from them of their reading of American financial gurus and business management experts and leaders in our business culture. I'd heard a lot about Alvin Toffler. I would hear a lot about Peter Drucker, whom I happen to read a lot and think very highly of. I was told by one industrialist that several years ago, his idol was Jacques Nasser of Ford before he fell upon hard days. And by a famous businesswoman that her model was Jack Welch before he became, instead of an example, a kind of disexample of certain things. But they were all sincere as they were talking to me about these examples, inspiring American models. And I thought, that's great, that's promising. And then I would find out more and more about how they ran their companies. And they ran them on very different principles, or lack of principles. There is, I'm sad to say, very little rule of law in Indonesia. There's very little transparency of business transaction, and very little accountability. And that's the reason I use the term split level. For the Americans, talk Peter Drucker or Jack Welch. In the office, pursue profit as you wish. Now, this is fairly well known, all of this behavior. And so the IMF, in the period of the crisis and since, well aware that lack of rule of law was a significant deterrent to reinvestment, issued a lot of letters of intent, co-signed by the Indonesian government, 18 of them in 6 years. 17 of them mentioned creating special commercial courts. We have to have something that can do something about bankruptcy, settle claims, resolve disputes, get at least some fundament of commercial law established here so we can proceed and money can come back and regenerate Indonesian growth, which had been growing previously. It's sadly now admitted that that experiment is largely a failure. Indonesia remains on Transparency International's international list of nations, among major nations. It is above only one in transparency, and that's Nigeria, which is not the country you want to compare yourself with in transparency. And that is an enduring problem because until rule of law and transparency get moving in Indonesia, investment will hesitate. Korea recovered from its financial crisis, got back its pre-crisis GDP in 2 years, 99. Thailand, also hard hit in that crisis, got its GDP back to pre-crisis levels in 4 years, in '01. And Indonesia is not yet back to its pre-crisis GDP. I hope for the best, and I hope for it soon. But I'll have to put in this series of remarks before I bring them to a close in a few minutes, put my hopes more strongly in political culture, which is growing and changing, than in business culture, which is slow to change, and military culture, which I fear may be even regressing. Two big things are happening in politics and the constitutional life of the Indonesian people. One is a devolution of power to the provinces. The Indonesians were tired of over-centralization under Suharto, which allowed all the key decisions to be made by him. He was hardworking, he stayed up late, he signed everything, he heard everything, he heard problems thrashed out, and he decided that's too much for a nation of 220 million people. For real leadership, effective, coordinated, efficient leadership, power has to be better distributed than that. And Indonesians believe that, and it's happening. Power is being devolved to the provinces. The biggest experiment in the world in decentralizing government is now going on in Indonesia. So watch it with interest and try to get good reports. Mr. Pak Duta, Mr. Consular official here, for progress on this. Ask him, how's it going? Not immediately, give him time to get established in Los Angeles, but that's something that he, I know, will be tracking very carefully, and all who care are doing that. The second great factor is that Indonesia is having its second open national election in a row, 2 in a row, for the first time in its history. It had one in 1955. Sukarno didn't like what followed and then shut it down, gave Indonesia guided democracy, in quotes. I have a chapter in my book called Guided Chaos, but I'm not supposed to sell my book from this podium. See you later in the Acacia Room X. The election of '99 was genuinely open and free. Jimmy Carter certified that it was, and he's an honest man. And he had a hard-searching group of observers all around Indonesia. There was an international group and Indonesian observers of their own elections. It was a huge effort. Now in '04, we'll have the second in a row. That's good. And the first direct presidential election. There's a lot to be said about that, which I don't have time to say. I want to pick out just one figure to show you that there are new forces at work in Indonesia and the hopes of leading Indonesia, and that's a candidate, you'll forgive me for referring to a personal friendship here, but a candidate named Nurholis Majid, Chak Nur is his nickname, who was an Eisenhower Fellow, and Diane in her introduction, I think, alluded to my period of that presidency of Eisenhower Fellowships. He was a fellows, the mid-career fellowship in professions of different kind. And he, as a Muslim leader and television commentator and sort of political wise man, a kind of combination of a religious figure and Walter Cronkite at the same time, very avuncular and trustworthy man, still young. People were beseeching him to run for president. No. Nobody would vote for me except my wife, he said. But now, he's announced, now, for next year, as an independent candidate. And the Indonesians are saying, akhirnya, dia turun gunung. At last, he's coming down from the mountain. And they're welcoming this candidate of an independent man, an uncorruptible man, who has declared 10 points that he stands for: rule of law, transparency, accountability, more education, to mention just 4. And I believe is an element of great hope. What happens to such an independent man in such a often convulsed country? One thing that could happen is that he would be bypassed. No party would think, well, let's take Chak Noor. He's famous, he's loved, he's trusted. But we're a political party. We can't do anything that daring. Another thing that could happen is that even though he says, you take my 10 points if you want me, there's no bargaining on that. I'll bargain with you on how we conduct things. I'll bargain with you on who's going to be the party vice president, who's going to be the treasurer, and how we fight this or that battle. That's bargainable, but not these 10 points. And some party or some coalition might say yes to that. Yes, all 10 points. Now. And then they devour him. I can't tell you how, I don't want to imagine how. But you can imagine voracious political appetites and operations anywhere in the world, including our own beloved United States, that lead men and movements in directions they didn't quite intend. A third thing that could happen is that he'd win. Then, God help him. And I'm facetious and I'm serious at the same time. Because winning, he would still have to be the same man he was. And he could not bring democracy to Indonesia by being Kemal Ataturk. I am Chak Noor, but now for the next 5 years I'm going to be Kemal Ataturk. That won't happen, because he is a man of integrity, he is himself. He's not going to rule by edict. He would try to rule by the kind of process by which he has lived. And all the gains would have to be incremental. It all have to be sweated out. It all have to be old-fashioned arm wrestling in order to get anything done. And I would wish him the best were he to win. And don't ask me for a prediction, because I don't have the faintest idea what will happen. But I hope to have given you to balance in your mind against the unhappy behavior of some or many in the army, the deplorable behavior of some in business who should know better. I hope to have given you a picture of a lot of Indonesian citizen hope, registered in changes in administration, changes of the Constitution, and their hope projected into the elections ahead of them, starting in April 2004. It would be unfair to leave you dangling there, so let me give just my present crude projection of my imagination of what might happen, and then invite your questions. If you put in your mind, because I've given you quotes from these men, General Riamizard in your mind fighting with Chak Noor in your mind, who would prevail in a fight? I don't know. But you must reckon, I must reckon, we must reckon, Indonesians must reckon with the power of a general as expresses himself as harshly as the man I quoted, as harshly in action, now in Aceh, as in individual cases, as in the case of Thais Eluwan, with a man of goodwill, a man of good heart, a man of integrity, a man of good intention, a man of good hope. I imagine, however that struggle might come out, Indonesia will continue to be a nation far sounder and stronger than, say, Nigeria, which is torn by Sharia law in the provinces, so the provinces are behaving without considering the central government. They're not devolving power to, the provinces are just voting to be different. Or Pakistan, where Islamist generals are in the preponderance, unlike Indonesia, where they're a minority of the military. And they're now a minority that don't want to be associated with anything as blamefully, hatefully murderous and useless as the bombings in Bali. So that has had an effect, a kind of inoculating effect against ultra-Islamism in Indonesia, and I can expand on that in the question period if you want. Are we going to see a nation surging ahead to become a Singapore, and a small-scale Singapore, or surging ahead into a corporate authoritarianism of China, which is doing quite well right now? No. Indonesia's sort of in between in size, 60 times as big as Singapore and 1/6 the size of China, and it'll find its own way and do its own thing. It's, I think, more likely to become a semi-anarchic democracy like the Philippines, another country I'm very fond of, but with a greater danger than the Philippines has of what I call anarcho-fascism because of the army, its uncontrollability in budget, and its apparent uncorrectability in human rights. So net, what do I think? Before anybody asks me, are you an optimist or a pessimist, I'll tell you. I'm an optimist in a one-year perspective. The election of 2004 will pull Indonesia ahead in all the respects of which I've spoken. I'm an optimist also in a 20-year perspective. 5 more free and open elections in Indonesia may have an irreversibly sound democracy, proven, by then 6 consecutive elections. But I have to admit also being a pessimist from day to day, because I don't know what the army is going to do. Let me rest there and invite your questions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the time we have, Dr. Friend has consented to take as many questions as we can. Let me remind you that questions are sentences with that strange little curly Q at the end. Please make them questions, not statements. Please make them as brief as possible so he has a chance to respond. And please, let's limit them to 1 at a time until we can get through everybody. Ma'am, yours first.
Could you comment on the role of Islam presently in Indonesia?
What is the role of Islam in Indonesia?
Well, it's a very big question, but thanks for the wide open invitation. All right. It is the religion on the census forms of 90% of the people. There's a fraction of those who are merely nominal Muslims. Then there are many kinds of real Muslims. And here's the point I think you probably really are asking for. Certainly the point I really want to answer. The number of textualist Muslims who think that all the truth is on the printed page is not as many as the syncretic Muslims, those who merge their Islam with previous cultural traditions, Hindu Buddhism in Central and Eastern Java, or other traditions in other parts of the country. So it is Islam in Indonesia has made a tremendous number of wise cultural accommodations across centuries. For me, it's a very comfortable environment in which to live religiously. Latent behind your question, maybe what about the Bali bombings, but maybe somebody else wants to ask that question.
Sir.
Is there any counterweight in the country to the power of the army? Is there trade unions or labor movements or any counter power?
What organizational counterweights may there be to the army in Indonesia?
That's another fine question. And the gentleman mentioned the possible example of trade unions, perhaps out of European history examples in his own mind. And I must say the trade union movement is quite weak in Indonesia and fights among itself. So it cannot serve as a counterweight to the army in its present form. Things will change across time, but not now. My own hope in that regard, as a counterweight hope, would be the NGOs, the non-government associations, organizations, private voluntary groups, and they've been growing. By 96 or 7, they were 5,000. There are more now. There's no recent count. But they're the kinds of things that we recognize as the vital part of American democracy. And Tocqueville recognized them in the United States in 1833 when he traveled here, 170 years ago. This is the thing that made America unique and distinct and worth writing about. People get together and they form their own voluntary associations, like, let's say, the Los Angeles World Affairs Council. This is one of the strengths of the United States. You gather voluntarily to think about these questions. You inform yourselves, you talk with others, you argue with each other. By doing so, you strengthen this country. The more that happens in Indonesia, the stronger Indonesia will have counterweights to its military.
What role does Islam play in the foreign relations of Indonesia?
What is the role of Islam in foreign relations in Indonesia?
Let me answer a little erratically with an example of Gus Dur, Abdurrahman Wahid as president, and then come to a more sober answer. He thought that he could be a kind of personal example as president of personal Islamic foreign policy. He began traveling around everywhere. And being a likable man and a good Muslim, and he thought that would make a foreign policy. It doesn't. Foreign policy is to be studied, thought out, prioritized, and enacted with care. As a sample of what he was doing, he came back from a trip from the Middle East while I was concluding a trip in Indonesia. I know him passably well. I had a short interview with him in the palace, the Istana Merdeka, the White House of Indonesia. He said, "Dory, when are you going home?" I said, "Tomorrow." Oh, he said, stay. I'm having Muammar Gaddafi for dinner on Thursday. I said, well, thanks, Gus-Dur, but no thanks. I've got, I've really had some friends' anniversary to go to in Denver, and I'm headed home. You cannot have celebrity foreign policy. You cannot have individualized foreign policy. So I've come around to a better answer to your question, Diane. Indonesia wants to play a big role in the Organization of Islamic States, and it does whenever it meets. It wants to play a significant role in ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which has been weakened the last 6 years by Indonesia's crisis weakness. It needs, in my view, to come back stronger there first before going on a world stage with Islamic politics, which is pretty tough right now, and then reclaiming a larger voice in the UN, which it also deserves. I hope that meets your query.
Yes, ma'am.
What role has the U.S. played in the development of the hindering the development of democracy in Indonesia over the past 20 years?
What is the role of the United States in either helping or hindering the development of democracy in the last couple of decades?
That's a good question, and with lots of answers. Let me think for a second and try to boil it down. There is a kind of journalist who writes books, and I'm using the title of one about the Philippines. It says just because the United States works with an autocrat, it is undermining per se the democracy or the potential for democracy of that country. The title of the book was Waltzing with Dictators. That's a catchy title. And then you can throw pictures on, in this case it's a picture of Ronald Reagan waltzing with Imelda Marcos, as if that were the statement about our policy, and as if he were embracing the autocracy of the early 1980s and late 70s, for that matter. The picture and the title do not state the truth. Let me quote Franklin Roosevelt and then change the context. As he said about a Latin American dictator, Caribbean dictator, in fact, he's our son of a bitch. So that meant, we've let him get away with this, and so we better let him continue to get away with it. That's too bad. I don't believe in that. I'm speaking now very personally in response to your question. I think any country that lets a dictator take over and then stay in power, in my view, that's their son of a bitch. And Suharto became Indonesia's son of a bitch. And eventually the Indonesians pulled him down. The United States does not have the power, should not wish the power, to be unseating any distasteful dictator any place they find him. And I stay aside from all the discussions of regime change that may lurk in your minds, because this discussion tonight is about Indonesia. I hope I've met your question. The positive side of it is we tried to help a lot once the movement towards democracy got there. We've thrown a lot of think money and support money and process money in through government sources, and I hope it's helping.
Could you please comment on the problem of terrorism in Indonesia?
Would you please comment on terrorism? We hear so much about it since 9/11 here, and is there a different terrorism that we talk about that happens in Indonesia?
Yeah, I'm glad to answer that. The Bali incident, 10/12/02, 1 month, 1 day, 1 year after 9/11/01, is the second most lethal event in this new era, if we want to call it a new era, that we're calling our war against terrorism. The Indonesians thought that's their war, the Americans against terrorism, or the Brits and the Australians and others who were helping. And then in Paddy's and Sari, a restaurant and discotheque, boom, 1,000 kilograms of potassium chlorate and 202 people dead by homegrown terrorists, Indonesian terrorists, out of the Ngroki Pesantren in South Central Java, but with also some of them having experience in Afghanistan and some in the southern Philippines, and some exiled connections in Malaysia and Singapore. There's a network. Al-Qaeda is a network, but this terrorism of the Jemaah Islamiyah, is the name of it, the group, is of Indonesians by Indonesians. For, what's the object? It's not nearly the same as Osama bin Laden's. It's for a caliphate of Southeast Asia, for an Islamic government of Indonesia, Malaysia, and the southern Philippines. So theirs is not a kind of world dominion view or anything like that. And they don't speak in the same rhetorical terms as Osama bin Laden, but they are terrorists nonetheless. That's now to speak of the starkest kind of terrorism in Indonesia. What's the reaction to it among Indonesians? Generally, it was repulsion as well as fear. We have that here. That can happen here. It was a net negative impact. And the generals and politicians, some of them are leaning Islamists, began to tilt the other way. And the police work done in this group was superb. 30 men arrested, trials are underway, others are being trailed down. I think Indonesia can and will keep its own terrorism under control. It doesn't make it an automatic ally in whatever we might, in a given week or month of policy making and policy change, see as our war on terrorism. Because our main difficulty is not with Jemaah Islamiyah, it's with, though we have difficulties with that. 7 Americans died, 90 Australians died, the demography of that event. It's bad planning by Amrozi, and others who didn't realize where the Australians went to celebrate at night and where the Americans went. Amrozi was dissatisfied with the death list because there weren't enough Americans on it. So it's not highly professional. It's not of highly educated people like those 19 Saudis and Egyptians and Bahrainis and others in the 4 hijacked planes, but it is dangerous stuff. The distinction I want to leave you with, though, is seeking a caliphate in part of Southeast Asia is very different from the continuing Al-Qaeda worldwide event. We should keep those things apart in our minds. Thanks for the question.
We try to say if there's anything. Sir.
There's a considerable oil and gas operations, of course, in Indonesia, mostly for export. What other economic engines are burgeoning or going to sustain it for the next 1 and 10-year window that you described?
Beyond oil and gas exploration in Indonesia, what are the other economic engines there?
There's still a tremendous strength in all kinds of agricultural produce or grown things, including timber. Indonesia became one of the world's very top pulp and plywood producers and remains there. It has, and things like they're more simple crops, sort of consumable by ordinary human beings, like vanilla and tapioca and coffee and tea. All of those things are profitable, and were profitable throughout the crisis. There are also, of course, textiles, though mainly for profit now, more on the Gap and Nike kind of putting together than beautiful batik, which many of you may own and may love. But there are lots of sources besides oil and gas. And in extractive industries, of course, there is gold and copper, especially in Papua.
I was curious if when you mentioned that 30% of the military is government paid, right? Is that correct?
Well, I'm talking about all of the military is theoretically government paid, but its income looked at candidly is 70% off budget out of different enterprises.
So I mean that from what I'm hearing is that seems to be a monumental problem. Are there any other countries with similar problems? What is the solution to that? I mean, we worry here because we have a volunteer army, and there are a lot of people who are concerned about the eventual impact of that, but this sounds far more worrisome.
Would you expand on the 70% off budget of the Indonesian army, and are there comparisons elsewhere in the world, and what are the solutions?
It's a very good question. I think I remember your name from the pre-dinner moments as Rebecca. You're nobody's Rebecca over there? No, sorry. It doesn't change the answer to my question. The question's a good one. I can't think of another country that on which one can be so specific. I just don't happen to have the data. 70% off budget is very high. The heart of your question, I dare to say, is how can you change that? And I agree with your worry about it. The only answer that occurs to me, frankly, is getting a president strong enough to face down the army and say, you have to become accountable. We're not taking away from you your share of the logging business here. Let's discuss your share of the gambling business there. I'll stop with those examples. Somebody has to be very strong to do that. The only way to do that is to get somebody of real integrity and patience, willing to listen to the army as well as tell them what to do. Sit down and get to know those generals. Say, we're not, if your men are dependent upon this for enough extra pay to do it, let's work on a bill through Parliament to increase pay. Or let's work on a bill that will allow all of these industries to be audited, and let's get fair shares distributed fairly throughout the whole military. Even as I talk with you, trying to answer you, I think our hero needs 2 terms. Okay?
Question down there, please.
What is the, how do people in that part of the world, Indonesia, other countries, view Australia? And how does Australia view its relation to these countries?
What is the geopolitical situation concerning Australia? How do the South Asian countries view Australia and vice versa?
Well, that's complex too, but deserves addressing. Australia would like to be seen as an Asian/Pacific power. Generally, I would say most Asian land countries and Southeast Asian nations would reverse the order of those adjectives. Well, that's a Pacific, and then more softly, Asian power. Its behavior in the East Timor crisis in '99, I happen to think, was exemplary, because somebody had to be prepared when the East Timorese, under the referendum of September '99, UN supervised, voted 4-1 for independence, and the Indonesian army went about trying to destroy the results. They tried to prevent it differently. They tried to make it happen the other way. I was there in the summer, June, the American summer, June, July, '99. And I saw the people who were herded into camps and given radio broadcasts in the morning to indoctrinate them on how to vote, and they weren't going to be released until voting day came. So it was an attempted manipulation in which the army failed, and then an attempted scorched earth policy as they left. There was immediate, which is not to say instant, UN attention to this. The UN does not do things instantly, but it got on the case, and within about 10 days had authorized a force to go in for peacekeeping. And the Australians were ready. That's the heart of my point. The Australians with a population of 1/11 that of Indonesia, were ready to put in a significant force. I think their complement was about 5,000 men, and about 2,000 from other, including Asian countries. Thai were well in there. Made up the peacekeeping force that reduced the deaths and brought back a form of order by November and December. That readiness was terribly important, even though it made them very unpopular, the Australians, with many Indonesians. But one takes the risks of unpopularity to do things that are straight and sound.
Does Indonesia's historical experience as a colonial power explain any of the cultural factors you mentioned?
Would the historical factors of colonialism explain any of the cultural issues that you spoke to?
That's very interesting. The Indonesians have a natural anti-colonialism, as you imply, and Sukarno, as president, made that a major theme. There's a picture in my book of him making a speech against colonialism in which his teeth are, I won't try to imitate, his teeth are gnashing, his hands are clawing at the imagined enemy within his reach. And this is 1963, a speech made in the city now known as Jayapura in Papua. And he, sorry if I'm not answering you directly enough. Here's another complement of the answer. Despite this anti-colonialism, Indonesians themselves have acted in a colonial fashion. In East Timor, gobbling it up by annexation against their will in 75, 76, and really absorbing Papua with the so-called Act of Free Determination in 69, where the UN stood back and let men be herded into halls and vote to be with Indonesia. I've got a photograph I couldn't get published because the newspaper that had it wouldn't let it go, in which all these men, you could see they were in uniform. And they all were given, as I learned from accompanying texts, chocolate, cigarettes, and food. So that's how they got that vote. I consider that colonialist action.
I understand that persons sometimes have two names, a Dutch name and a Chinese name. I know of such a person. I just wondered if that still goes on. Two names.
Would there be such a thing as two names anymore of Dutch and Chinese?
Well, it's much more complicated than that. And I'll leave our friend, the Consul General, to explain these things to you in private conversation, and he'll do a great job. But let me give you an even more complicated example for fun. I know a woman whose history on her father's side is Chinese Indonesian for 3 generations, and on her husband's side it's Chinese Indonesian for about 10 generations, I mean going back hundreds of years. And they consider themselves both Chinese and Indonesian, but chiefly Indonesian in culture, but because of the prejudice against Chinese in the 1960s, they were required to adopt Indonesian names, which they did. I won't give the name here. But they have an Indonesian name for a lot of purposes, Chinese names for tradition, and she, because her grandmother married a Czech adventurer, an artist, a very lovable man, no doubt, keeps that Czech name as her used family name. Because in the Dutch system, having European blood or associations got you higher in the layer cake of society. Just to suggest complications that our new friend and resident of Los Angeles can expand on.
In the back, please.
Yes. Well, I think 6 years ago, nobody has predicted that, say, governmental decentralization will take place to that degree. That is really a drastic change. Now the question is, within the coming 6 years, what kind of social change do you predict?
If there's been this amount of decentralization in the last 6 years, what do you expect over the next 6 years in terms of social change?
Well, that's a provocative question by a great futurist who knows I can't possibly answer that. And if I knew, I would be making money as a business advisor or a risk analysis or a riskless analysis advisor. But it's fun to think about it. The things that I hope will happen, I hope are clear in what I've been saying. But to risk a guess at what might happen faster than I'm implying it'll happen is that what we call in the West civil society will race ahead much more swiftly and coherently than it's doing now. Excuse me, I'm shielding my eyes against that light above your head there, so that I can look gratefully at you for a good question. The civil society is a very new idea to Indonesians. They don't know all the things that constitute it. But if they begin to get an idea of what a force it can be, the way the East Europeans got that idea in the 1980s and expressed it in the 1990s, if that were to happen in Indonesia, then we would see major changes of great, great value. Thanks for the question.
Ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who are interested in Dr. Friend's book, we're going to adjourn next door in just a minute for the book signing with him. Before Mrs. Glazer comes back to close the program, we're going to have one last question, which I'll take from Mrs. Glazer.
Okay. As a follow-up to a question asked previously, since the military budget, you said 70% is controlled off budget, which implies that the generals have little private businesses going. Doesn't that turn them into warlords, and wouldn't they have control over what government runs the country?
Well, because of the amount of off-budget military expenditures, does that turn the generals into warlords, and does that in turn control the country?
That's a fair question by analogy from other countries, from China, for instance, where the Chinese government is trying to constrain against this very same phenomena, which does occur there. And that term is actually used by some Indonesians about some of their military. Another term that they use is mafia, spelled M-A-F-Y-A, which does resemble, of course, what you've heard, that same usage in Russia. And there are analogies there, against which analogies we hope, referring to the previous questioner, other things will prevail. Thanks very much.
Had a pretty long walk getting up here. Dr.
Theodore Friend is author of Indonesian Destinies. It's published by Harvard University Press, on the web at hup.harvard.edu. Next week on History on Book TV, April Blood. Lauro Martinez considers political violence in Florence during the Italian Renaissance. If you're interested in finding out